Welcome back, everybody. I think we are ready with the next panel to get started. Matt, I'll go ahead and show the plan for this particular session, and it's on protecting privacy. So take it away, Matt.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. Um, so we've got a full session here. So we're gonna shoot for our each speaker at about 13 minutes. I'll hop on and nudge you to wrap it up. Our first speaker will be Tom Lazovich from the Census Bureau. I'm sorry, Tomo. Forgive me. Let's see if you can share your slides and how your audio is looking.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and are my slides full screen now?
Yep, everything looks good.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to start a little timer just so I can keep track myself. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session, and thanks to the GASP organizers for inviting me to speak. Today, my name is Tom Lazovich. I'm from the XD team at the Census Bureau. We're an emerging technology group, and today I'm going to talk about how you can audit the performance of your machine learning models using potentially sensitive data in a privacy preserving way. And the usual disclaimer that everything in here is my own personal views. I'm not speaking for the Census Bureau or anybody else. And this is work that I did together with Mike Walton. So to start off, we've seen at this conference and pretty much everywhere you look that the adoption of AI and machine learning is rising rapidly. This is a figure from the Stanford AI Index, which kind of tracks AI trends, showing, from 2003 to 2023, the use of AI has really grown exponentially. It's everywhere. I think we would all agree on that. At the same time, as the adoption of artificial intelligence and machine learning rises, we also see a higher number of AI-related incidents reported. And what I mean by incidents is some kind of harm happening, whether it's discrimination, whether it's even something like a self-driving car injuring someone, something like that. There's a multiple databases that keep track of this sort of thing, and kind of as you might expect, as the prevalence of AI in society has increased, so too have the kind of reported incidents, the reported harms. And this is a kind of the G in GASP is for government, and the federal government itself has not been immune to such incidents. There have been situations where agencies have used AI to decide benefits eligibility, to kind of screen applicants for certain things, to decide who gets audited, et cetera. And um, there have been issues of bias, people being denied when they're not supposed to be, things like that. So all this is to say is we really need, if we're going to be adopting AI and keeping up with innovation that's happening and using the latest technologies to serve the American public, we really need to build AI in a responsible way, with an emphasis on the real world human impacts and some of the principles that typically get thrown around in that RAI, responsible AI space, are things like being human-centric, transparent, accountable, and privacy-preserving. And so today I'm going to focus a little bit on the privacy-preserving aspect, though there are, it kind of touches on all the other bits too. So to dive into a specific problem, a specific model auditing scenario, one that is very common in the machine learning literature is to take your performance metric and measure it across different subpopulations of your data set. So that could be, most commonly it's across demographic groups. So like race and ethnicity, gender, geographic location, language, etc. And we want to understand how our model performs across those different subgroups in our data set to see if there are any disparities in that performance. So that's kind of the framing of the problem that we're trying to do here. It's only one way of addressing kind of these bigger picture harms, but it is one of the ways that most frequently manifests itself. So if I'm the model auditor, my goal is to evaluate model performance conditional on some kind of sensitive attribute. So in this diagram here, I've got the model predictions. It has some inputs. In this case, it's a binary output. And I'm joining that data set model predictions with a data set containing group membership, sensitive attributes, demographics. I'm joining that data set, applying some function to it, and getting a group-wise evaluation metric on the other side. That's the ideal situation. In practice, however, the model owner and the model auditor don't necessarily have access to this sensitive attribute data set. A lot of agencies don't have demographic data. A lot of companies don't have demographic data. So how can you do this kind of group-wise auditing, group-wise measurement if you don't have direct access to that data set? And that's really the question that we're trying to answer with this family of techniques that we're labeling privacy-preserving model auditing. How can we protect the privacy of the sensitive attribute data set while still getting useful metrics that we can use to understand how our model performs across subpopulations? And as you might have expected from the privacy-preserving part of that name, is we're trying to leverage our expertise in privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs for short, to enable this model auditing with sensitive data. So, this is a session on protecting privacy, so I don't think I have to go into too much detail here, but taking a step back and thinking about PETs and their overall goal, we're really trying to enable analysis and gain insights without revealing private information. I typically think of two main buckets for that sort of work. One is adding noise, things like differential privacy, synthetic data set generation. The other bucket is kind of encryption-based techniques, homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation. And we're going to look at one technique from each of these buckets just as an example in this talk today. So first, I'm going to start with an example of adding noise. How can we add noise to that sensitive attribute and still get useful metrics out on the other end? So just to go back to the picture we were looking at before, the model auditor doesn't have direct access to the data set with the sensitive attribute, but what they do get access to, what they do get shared, is a data set that has differential privacy technique applied to it. In this case, we're going to be looking at randomized response. So we've got a categorical variable that's defining a group membership, race and ethnicity, gender, etc. And then there's some probability that the true value of that attribute migrates to a different bin, essentially. And it's an equal probability to migrate across all the other bins. And we can kind of set our privacy budget by controlling what that probability of migration is. And so what the auditor actually gets is not the true sensitive attribute, but they're getting a noisy version of it. As you can see here, in this case, one of the triangles flipped to a circle, so they're going to get a different result. And the question is, can we still get useful information out of this noisy attribute data set that's been privacy protected with differential privacy? So what we first looked at was just kind of out of the box, if we take a very common fairness or bias metric from the machine learning literature called demographic parity, which is comparing the model's propensity to flag instances as positive across different demographic groups. And really, it's the difference between the highest and the lowest probability. So if there's no disparity across demographic groups, that difference is 0. And what we did was, let's look at adjusting this migration probability, kind of adding different levels of noise, adjusting our privacy budget, and seeing how close this demographic parity difference metric was to the quote unquote true value in cases where we added noise. And what you can see here, so on the x-axis, epsilon is the privacy budget. So as epsilon goes up, we're adding less noise. As it goes down, we're adding more noise. And the dashed line is what you get from the kind of true demographics, the no noise data set. And what you can see is that this particular metric, which is very commonly used in the literature, is not robust at all to the noisy demographic data set out of the box. As we add more noise, as our privacy budget decreases, what was initially a data set that had a particular disparity um, in model performance, that gets washed away when we're trying to measure it on the noisy data set. So the metric fidelity decreases as we add more noise. This is not particularly surprising, but interesting nonetheless. So can we correct for that? We know that with randomized response, there's statistical techniques that we can use to correct for the randomized response noise. And it turns out that yes, we can correct for it. So I don't have time to get into the details here, but essentially the way we correct for it is we model the noise by applying a logistic regression and then impute the true demographics from the noisy data. So we create a bunch of imputed data sets and then calculate and combine calculate new metrics from those imputed data sets. And what we see now as a function of the privacy budget on the left was a simpler problem with two sensitive classes, and the blue is what we had with no correction for the noise. The orange is what we got from computing the metric on these imputed data sets. And we see that the orange is, except for at very low epsilons, is significantly closer to what we would consider the true value. So that's great. In a more complicated problem that had 9 sensitive classes, and in particular, some of those sensitive classes had very low population, it doesn't perform as well. But at least it's not underestimating the disparity anymore. It is overestimating it a bit at low epsilons, and then as you get higher, it gets better. So this is kind of promising to say, okay, maybe differential privacy will actually work for privacy-preserving model auditing. The next example I'm going to show is an encryption-based example. So there we take a protocol that was open sourced by Google called Private Joining Compute. And the idea here is that it's computing a private set intersection with a sum that's associated with a feature. So essentially what's happening is we have two parties. They each have a data set, data entries that have a common ID associated with them. Think like social security number, credit card number, etc. And then one party also has a feature associated with that ID. So those are the inputs to the protocol. And what comes out on the other end is that both parties get to know the size of the intersection, so how many IDs they shared between them. And then the party with the feature gets to know the sum of the feature for the IDs that were in that intersection. So in this example, it's the IDs 2 and 3, so they get 1500. And this happens in a fully encrypted manner. The sum is done via homomorphic encryption. So neither party gets to know who's in the data set, who's in the shared data set. Neither party gets to see the other party's data, but in the end, they do get this kind of useful information. So how can we use that to do the kind of thing that we did before with the differential privacy? Well, instead of some random feature from our data set, the feature that we're going to be sending in is the result of comparing our model's prediction to the ground truth on our evaluation or test set. So it's kind of this binary vector where 1 is it was correct and 0 was incorrect. So now when you're taking the sum of this feature and dividing by the intersection size, what you're getting is an accuracy for the specifically for the IDs that were in the intersection of this data set. So it is the accuracy for a subgroup of the total data set. So then how do we look at demographic disparities with that? Well, what we do is we set up multiple servers, one for each demographic group we want to measure, and we run this, the client comes and runs this protocol against each server. So they're computing 4, 5, however many groups you have, private set intersections, and getting this sum as a result, and that's how they can end up getting their group-wise accuracies. And just to show kind of what that looks like in practice, we actually built a demo of this in cloud.gov, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but just to show you that essentially what we're running is from this picture, we've got, in this case, there were 3 demographic groups, and we had kind of servers running for each one. And then the client, this is a very rudimentary command line demo, but the client essentially runs the protocol, the private set intersection against each demographic group, gets that a group-wise accuracy result out, and then you can compare. And there are also many other metrics that can be expressed as kind of the sum of this binary vector. You could throw false positives, true positives, whatever your evaluation result is. in there. So this is pretty flexible, but it does have to kind of be expressible as that group-wise sum divided by the intersection size. And this demo is open source on GitHub. If you want to take a look at it, the link is there. So just to finish up, to kind of sum up, in this talk, I went through sort of two different techniques for what we're calling privacy-preserving model auditing, applying PETs to allow you to use sensitive data to audit your model's performance across subgroups. And each one has kind of advantages and disadvantages. The differential privacy is sort of easier to apply. It has lower computational overhead. I think the packages that are out there are more well developed. The main disadvantage is that it's not an exact calculation. As we saw, there's noise. The metric fidelity isn't always great, especially if you have smaller demographic groups. Compare that to the homomorphic encryption, where it is an exact calculation and no direct data transfer is needed. We're not handing someone a noisy data set. The only thing that gets exchanged are these kind of encrypted features. The disadvantages, one is that it is much slower computationally. Encryption takes a lot more overhead. It's less flexible because the metrics have to be expressed kind of in this sum fashion. And it is kind of vulnerable to attacks if your partner designs a vector in a particular way, for example, sends a 1 and all zeros, they could kind of figure out an individual's group membership. So all that is to say is PETs can be helpful for model auditing with sensitive data sets, but you need to consider the trade-offs very carefully depending on your use case. And I'll stop there and say thank you. And here's my contact info. Happy to answer questions at the end.
Awesome, thank you. And I should have opened up as we transition to our next speaker, Amanda Conant from RTI. Just a reminder for folks, if you're just joining for this session or you're new to the conference, there's a Q&A feature. So if you have a specific question for the speaker, put it in there and we'll make sure that we direct it to them. And hopefully we'll have a couple minutes at the end of the session for Q&A. All right, Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Conant. I'm a data scientist in the Center for Data Science and AI at RTI International. And today I'll be presenting the work that was done in collaboration with BLS and RTI to make autocoders privacy preserving. Bit of an overview here. The algorithm I'll be talking about today is for training deep learning models such that you get privacy guarantees, strict bounds on disclosure risk. They are scalable, meaning it'll work with modern models that use lots of data. They're high performant, providing minimal accuracy loss compared to non-private models, and they have real-world utility, so you can use them on imbalanced or multi-class data sets. So a bit of background, as I'm sure many are familiar, survey coding is the process of assigning numerical codes to free-form text responses in surveys so that they can actually be used in statistical analyses directly. As an example, the interviewer can ask what your job title is, the respondent can answer plumber, and then that gets categorized to a specific numeric code. How this is traditionally done is through training coders on the classification system, but this is a really time-consuming and labor-intensive process. So over the years, many people have developed auto-coding methods, which are computer programs or algorithms that automatically assign codes for coders. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, has a set of autocoders called the SOI autocoders, which code for the Survey of Occupational Injury and Illness. If you look at the figure here about which shows the percentage of SOI codes that are automatically assigned to the survey every year, and currently they're at about 85% of all codes being automatically assigned, with some processes on the back end for manual coding if the model is not confident in its prediction. Because these models work really well, BLS receives a lot of requests from external parties to use the SOI autocoders. For example, other government agencies, other surveys that also code occupational injury. However, they're unable to release the models at this time because there is disclosure risk. The reason being that machine learning models can actually leak information about their training data set if you know how to get it. So how exactly can that be done? Well, the most common way is through membership inference attacks, where the attacker's goal is to determine whether or not a single record or observation is present in the model's training data set. So say BLS releases the SOI autocoder, an attacker could take that model and get a prediction for a single observation. They can then pass that on to an attack model which they train themselves, and that attack model predicts whether or not a record was in or out of the model's target training set. How do we defend against this? Well, we just need to release a model that's not susceptible to these kinds of attacks. To do this, we have to be able to quantify our disclosure risk. If we don't release the model at all, we have no disclosure risk for any of the data, but VLS wants to be able to release this model. So we have to figure out how to train the model in a different way, which brings in the concept that the previous presenter talked about of differential privacy. Differential privacy is a way to quantify privacy mathematically. Basically, the essential guarantee you get is that if an algorithm is applied to two different databases that differ by a single record, you will get similar output. So the outcome that you get is the same with or without that single observation. In the case for machine learning or supervised machine learning, those two databases are just two different training sets that differ by one training example. And because we're isolating the difference to all of our outcomes, when just one single observation is out of the data set, we're able to rigorously quantify privacy. Now, currently, the most common way that people implement differential privacy for machine learning training specifically is called differentially private stochastic gradient descent, or DPSGD. For those of you who are unfamiliar with SGD, that's stochastic gradient descent. It's just a really common machine learning optimization algorithm to train machine learning models. And what it does is it iteratively updates model parameters in the direction of the negative gradient of the loss. You can think about it like dropping a marble onto a wavy surface. So if you look at the image, it's sort of like the model parameters are iteratively updating until they reach the bottom of that bowl or the minimum loss. In DPSGD, those gradients actually get clipped, and we add random noise at each step. And this is a really popular way, again, just because it is such an elegant and easy implementation and it works on a really common optimization algorithm already. However, this method often has poor utility in practice. Enter SWAG PPM, which is the method sort of developed by this work, and it stands for Gaussian Stochastic Weight Averaging Pseudo-Posterior Mechanism. This work is really a combination of two pieces of prior research: the pseudo-posterior mechanism, which is the differential privacy piece, and then the Gaussian stochastic weight averaging, or SWAG, which is the way that this works for deep learning models. All right, so what is the pseudo-posterior mechanism? It works completely differently than DPSGD. Rather than adding noise, we actually get privacy by sampling. So what we do is we draw a set of model parameters, a single set, from the posterior distribution, which is the set of all plausible parameter sets, given your training data, the model architecture, and hyperparameters. And if you look at the screen here, if this is an example posterior distribution, you can see that we are sampling with probability of how well the model actually describes the data. And because we are sampling and obtaining a plausible parameter set and not an exact one, we are afforded some privacy. And then there's the additional piece to this, which is the pseudo aspect, which makes the differential privacy work in the context of deep learning by incorporating something called risk-based weighting. Now, if you think about a data set, not every single observation poses equal security risk. There are some observations that are in very highly populated classes. So if you exclude or include that one single observation, you're not going to change the model fit very much. However, if you have an observation that's from a smaller class or is otherwise really difficult to predict, the risk is going to be much higher, as your model fit is going to change more drastically whether or not you have that observation in the data. Therefore, we introduced risk-based weighting, which is the PPM method introduces risk-based weighting, which is down-weighting those riskier observations and limiting how much they can affect the model fit. And then how do we actually estimate the posterior distribution? Well, that's the SWAG piece of it. First, we start by fine-tuning a model with a small learning rate until you get to a local minima or to convergence. Then you continue training with a larger constant learning rate around that same area, as you can see with the blue arrows, in that local minima space. And the innovation that SWAG provides is actually that you can take snapshots or screenshots of those iterations and use those to estimate your Gaussian, a multivariate Gaussian as the approximate posterior distribution. This is the algorithm altogether. I won't spend time going through this just in the interest of time, but essentially combining the SWAG and PPM piece allows you to estimate that posterior distribution and then sample from it. Okay, how did we actually test our model through our experiments? The data that we used was the set of publicly available severe injury reports from the OSHA dataset. It's not the same dataset as SOI, however, it has a similar structure and the same outcomes. Our input here is the final narrative. So for example, a truck driver fell approximately 4 feet while descending a tanker trailer ladder. To predict the outcome nature of injury, and here in this case, it would be traumatic injuries and disorders unspecified. Our actual data set was sampled using stratified samplings that we capped the number of observations per class at 200, leaving a total of around 10,000 observations across 153 classes. And even though we did that stratified sampling, you can see our training distribution is still very highly skewed. For our method, it's pretty straightforward. We fine-tuned a model of the same architecture as the SOI autocoders, and we did this 3 different ways. The first is through non-private fine-tuning or a baseline model. Then we used our 2 differential privacy mechanisms, the sort of most highly studied one, which is DPSGD, and the novel method here, which is SWAG PPM. We did compute the privacy loss budget, which, without going into too much detail here, is sort of just how much privacy the model spends while training. And we also computed some utility metrics for all of our models. And before I move on to our results, just a quick note here, there is sort of a trade-off, of course, between privacy and utility, where the more private you make your model, the less overall utility you can have, and vice versa. All right, for our results, there's a couple things I wanted to point out here. The first is that SWAG PPM and DPSGD, the 2 different differentially private methods, had very similar privacy loss budgets, which means they spent around the same amount of that privacy budget during training. However, SWAG PPM actually had only a modest drop in utility compared to the non-private model. So if we look at those weighted and macro F1 scores, there's a slight drop for SWAG PPM, but is pretty comparable to the non-private model. Whereas DPSGD had a much more significant drop in utility compared to the non-private model, sort of to the point where you wouldn't really want to use it for prediction. So why do we think that is? Why did we have a model with similar privacy protections as DPSGD, but with much better utility? Well, we believe that's due to the risk-based weighting component. So DPSGD, as I mentioned earlier, applies noise to the gradients and clips them as you move through training, and that sort of affects all the records globally, regardless of what class they're in. However, SWAG PPM downweights records that actually have high privacy risk, which have high loss. So the model has, if the model struggles to predict those records, they are at a higher risk for changing all the observations, whether or not they're in the model. And those high loss records just tend to be concentrated in those rarer classes, which is something that non-private models struggle with already. If you look at the figure here, we have the utility for all of the different classes of various class sizes for our 3 experiments, where the blue circles are the non-private model, the green squares are SWAG PPM, and the red triangles are DPSGD. If you look all the way to the left, those are all of the utility metrics, the F1 scores for those smaller class sizes, and then to the right are the larger class sizes. On those small class sizes, you can see that the non-private and the SWAG model both struggle to predict a lot of those. You'll see kind of at the bottom right corner, there's a lot of green squares down there. And those are the observations that the model is more heavily downweighting because they are from those less populous classes and they are riskier observations. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have all of our utility metrics from those higher populous classes. Those are hardly downweighted at all through the SWAG PPM metric because, as I mentioned, not having or having one single observation from those classes doesn't make a large difference on the overall model fit. Whereas DPSGD sort of struggles for those smaller class sizes and has a moderate increase for larger class sizes, but overall that risk-based weighting mechanism allows us some privacy afforded while maintaining pretty decent utility. All right, in conclusion, SWAG PPM is an algorithm for training deep learning models that have privacy guarantees, are scalable, high performant, and you can use them on real-world data. Next steps for this work are to repeat the experiment on the full soy data, perform membership inference attacks so we get a better idea of what our disclosure risk actually is for the soy autocoders, and then to develop an open source Python package so that others may privacy protect their autocoders and share them as well. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end or via email.
Thanks, Amanda. That was perfect timing. Again, as we transition to our next speaker, who will be Alon Sagar from Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll direct them to the speakers. Alon? All right, I can
Okay,
see your slides. We can hear you. All right.
perfect. Okay. Happy to be here, especially to be a part of this very interesting session. Already some of the things we've seen are fascinating. So for those that don't know me, my name is Alon Segura. I'm a research economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And right now I'm going to be talking to you about something a little bit more low tech than some of the kind of privacy methods that have already been discussed, but still really, really useful because it's is so widely used across a lot of statistical agencies currently. And kind of to help this, we'll be talking about Taco, which specifically addresses the problems that I'm going to discuss. So first, a little example to kind of help motivate things. This is a table that has data that's very similar to a table we might publish for our census of fatal occupational injuries. So here, essentially, we've got fatality counts that are broken down by gender, as well as the event or the type of injury that was sustained. And you can see we've published some cells and we've suppressed some other cells for various reasons. If you're looking at this for any given time, you might start to figure out, well, even though some of these cells are not there, that are omitted, there's still some information that you could possibly get from them. So right off the bat, if you're to look at transportation, you see the total, you see the number of male fatalities. So you can think, oh, perfect, I can back out the count for women. You can keep going. You might look at exposure and equipment events, and you see the totals again. Okay, I can see clearly there are 0 fatalities there. And you can keep going and essentially even go as far as kind of producing potential ranges for the other cells until you've essentially filled in every single cell for this table. Now, all this information is coming directly from essentially the column and table sums. So this information is there. There's no new information being provided. It is in the background. And what we want to do in a nutshell with this project is essentially develop tools to programmatically fill in all these table cells. Why might we want to do that? 2 different reasons, which I'll be talking about over and over again over the course of this talk. Number one is it helps kind of assess how well our suppression methods are doing, but also we can augment what we publish by essentially potentially publishing the ranges themselves. Okay, so a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk briefly about statistical disclosure limitation methods. Gives a little bit more background to how we might get into this kind of situation where Taco is needed. Then I'm going to talk to you about how Taco works, how we've used Taco BLS, and then finally I'll conclude with some future work that is going to happen. Okay, so first and foremost, for those that aren't familiar, statistical disclosure limitation is essentially a whole suite of methods, sometimes they're called privacy enhancing technologies as well, that are aimed around protecting the confidentiality of the individuals and organizations that provide us data. We're mandated as a statistical agency by acts like SIPC. But even setting aside the regulatory requirements that we have to follow, it's really important that we protect the confidentiality because a lot of the faith that our respondents have is based off of faith in us protecting that confidentiality, right? If they feel like there's a perception that we're being a little loose with what we publish, they're less likely to give us their information in the future. So especially as a statistical agency where collecting data is of paramount importance for us, it's important that we protect the confidentiality of our respondents. In terms of the SDL methods that are out there, I like to think of them in kind of 2 buckets, and a bunch of these have already kind of been alluded to in previous talks. You can go about non-perturbative methods, things like rounding, top and bottom coding, coarsening when you're combining categories, cell suppression, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment. And then also you have more perturbative methods where you're adding some kind of noise, including differential privacy, which has already been discussed briefly. But for here, the method that I want to focus on is suppression. And the main reason is because we have a long history of it. It's something that a lot of statistical agencies have been employing for decades. And even to this day, there are still many, many data products that are protected primarily using self-suppression. So what do I mean by self-suppression? Let's be really, really clear. So here's another table. It's completely fictitious data. Again, you can think of this as maybe like employment counts that's broken down by age and industry categories. If we want to employ self-suppression on this, you can think of this as a two-step process. First step is primary suppressions. So these are going to identify cells that are kind of in and of themselves potentially sensitive. So this kind of one cell that's been circled here might be sensitive because there's only one individual, so you might be worried that it helps identify whoever it is responded and contributed that data point. There are various rules you can use to kind of identify these primary suppressions. I'm happy to talk about them for those people that are curious. So that's step one. However, if you just suppress that cell, looking at either the row sum or the column sum, it's very easy to back out that cell. So what we actually need to do is suppress a little bit more to protect that primary suppression. So those are often called complementary suppressions or sometimes secondary suppressions. And in a nutshell, these are just additional omissions or additional cells that we're going to omit so that we kind of reach a state where everything that's omitted is protected in some way or another. The really important point here is that, as I've kind of illustrated through this example, is that you have multiple options for these complementary suppressions. So at the end of the day, you have a lot of flexibility and levers about which sets of complementary suppressions you might choose kind of going forward. Now, as far as how you would actually choose them, there's two groups of methods you can kind of think about. You can think about heuristic methods, which are generally a little bit easier to implement, but all they do is kind of a minimum bar, is that they just protect exact identification of the suppressed cells. You might be able to implicitly guess the cell range very, very close, but you won't be able to extract the exact value. Kind of next step, a little bit more complicated, are exact or optimal methods. These ones, essentially, you're going to be able to say things like, I want to be able to protect all suppressed cells so that the identifiable range is at least 5, for example. These are definitely more complicated to implement. However, both sets of these methods, there can be situations where you're not able to actually implement any of these formal algorithms. This could be because of computational considerations. Some of these algorithms are very particular to specific types of publications and may just not be applicable in your situation. So a lot of times statistical agencies may have to rely on a little bit more ad hoc suppression algorithms. But what this means is we may not have a really good idea how well we're actually protecting the underlying data. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of the motivation for why we might need a tool to help audit or assess how well these ad hoc algorithms are working. Okay, so now, talking about Taco, real quickly, I'm going to outline the problem that Taco is helping to solve. Just a little bit of math here. You can kind of think of this more generally as we're going to have a vector x observed, which is, these are all the observed statistics. You can think of that table, any cell where we have a published statistic. And you can think of X suppressed. These are going to be all the unobserved statistics, so all the suppressed cells. This might also include other cells that aren't explicitly listed in the table, but nonetheless are suppressed because they're not showing up anywhere. You can think of like another column for other, let's say for the event type, for example. We're going to have a known set of linear constraints. So here, these are essentially all the relationships that involve the row sums, column sums that you see in tables, all the understandable relationships between all the cells in table, and then potentially a set of known bounds. And essentially, the solution that we're looking for is we're just trying to find for each of those suppressed statistics, we want to find the minimum possible value that could take that satisfies all the restraints, all the constraints, and all the published statistics, as well as the maximum value. And you can imagine if the minimum and maximum are the same, that's essentially telling you that you can exactly identify that suppressed statistic. Okay. So if you're looking at that, for those that are kind of familiar with the optimization literature, you say, look, Alon, that's just a linear programming problem. Like, we've been studying these for decades. There's not really any issues here. This should be very, very easy to solve. But there are a few hurdles to keep in mind. Number one, we want to be able to identify missing cells. That's not immediately obvious. Aren't easy ways to do that necessarily. So like I said, there might be other columns. Also, identifying all the constraints can be a little bit tricky, especially when you're talking about large releases of data with very complex nested tables. Takes a bit of work to get those all down. And then finally, you may have to handle many of these optimizations. So even if one linear program problem is simple to solve, you may have many, many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of them. So to give you a sense of this, I'm going to zoom all the way to example 2 here. So for that census of fatal occupational injuries, our latest data release for reference year 2023, if you look at the full set of statistics we published a little bit less than 250,000 counts. This led to about 700,000 unpublished counts, and in total almost 12,000 constraints. So again, you can think, those unpublished counts, those are the suppressed cells that you might want to solve for. So even if you have a very fast linear programming model, when you're talking about solving for hundreds of thousands of these variables, you want to be a little bit smart about it. Okay, so that, in a nutshell, brings us to Taco. And what this is essentially a Python tool to help you solve for these implicit ranges. It has various methods that will help you identify missing cells, validate variable hierarchies, and solve for these implicit optimizations. It's built fairly generally. Right now, it's for linear constraints, but that's something that's going to be relaxed in the future. And like I said, it's all built in Python, uses pretty standard packages. Okay. Quick overview of the process for using Python really is involved in just 3 steps. On the input side, you're going to essentially feed it a data frame that tells you what are the statistics that are observed, as well as kind of the characteristics of those statistics, like what do they condition on, kind of gives you a sense of the relationships between them. And then on the right side, essentially what's going to get output is data on all the unobserved or suppressed cells. And here the data, I mean, is going to give you those optimization bounds, those minimum and maximum bounds on those suppressed cells. In terms of actually using the Taco package, just 3 steps of balance cells, which is essentially going to find all those missing cells that you may have forgotten to tell us about. Inferring the constraints, so it's going to take a variable hierarchy, and it's essentially going to figure out all the linear constraints between all the statistics that are observed and unobserved. And then finally, third, it's going to solve those implicit bounds. So let's say you've done step 1 and step 2. I'm happy to talk about those for those that are interested. I'm going to focus on step 3 when you're actually solving those bounds. We have 3 different options that Taco provides. Option 0 is kind of a half option. It's a very quick way to find exact solutions, but it essentially ignores the essentially bounds on the overall bounds on any statistic. So really what you want to focus on is option 1 and option 2. Option 1, essentially going to use a linear programming solver. You're just going to iterate over every single cell, solve that problem. So it's very fast. We've got lots of history of solving these problems, so it's pretty easy to do. But if you've got many of these cells to solve for, that may not be optimal. So instead, what we've also done is produced option 2, which is constraint propagation, which allows us to essentially solve all those bounds simultaneously in an iterative manner. Again, I'm happy to go into more detail about that for those that are interested. And I've kind of already talked about these. We've got pros and cons between the 2 of them. LP Solver, much more well-informed in terms of history, but it can take a long time, especially if you're solving for hundreds of thousands of cells. And constraint propagation is kind of the flip side of that, is that it's able to solve all at once, but it's definitely only going to be applicable for linear constraints. While the LP Solver, kind of all the framework is there that even if there are nonlinear constraints, you can kind of substitute out a different solver and still kind of move forward. Okay. With the final couple minutes I have, I'm going to talk about how we use this at Taco, or how we use Taco at BLS. So first and foremost is, like I mentioned before, is assessing how well our suppression method is actually working. So how do we do this? Again, we run, we might use a method, run it through Taco, all the suppression to the result, and we can see what the picture actually looks like for all those suppressed cells, and that can help us choose among potentially different suppression algorithms. If we run the output from each of them, we can get a sense of how much is identifiable. So to give you an example, last year during production of reference year 2023 CFOI, we were essentially tweaking our hypercube algorithm, which is what we use to implement suppressions in our published data. And we're able to do different tweaks each time, run it through Taco, and it would produce output that kind of looks similar to below here, where it has different cell types. Explicit cells are cells that are found actually in the table. Implicit ones are kind of those other columns. And we can see for each of those cells, how many of them were exactly derivable but non-zero, how many of them were derivable as 0, how many of them had a very sensitive range, how many had an implicit bound range that was perhaps large enough that we didn't have to worry about. And this helps you kind of assess the different methods. And then finally, in terms of augmenting suppression output, you can think of, rather than just publishing tables with completely omitting the cells that we want to suppress, why not actually just replace those cells with those implicit ranges? Again, we're not providing any more information. Theoretically, anybody who saw a table that had suppressed cells could work out the math themselves, figure out these ranges. So we might as well do the legwork ourselves to put that information front and foremost so it's easier for our data users. This is something we're still investigating, but hopefully at some point down the line, this is something we might be able to implement at BLS. And finally, just to kind of wrap up and summarize, Taco is a Python package that essentially helps us solve this problem of figuring out what these implicit ranges are in all the suppressed cells. And with that information, we can assess suppression algorithms as well as potentially augment them by actually publishing the ranges themselves. Future work has a bunch of different dimensions. Right now, it goes relatively quickly. I'd like to refactor everything in polars to make it go even faster. And there are various few other kind of ways I'd like to extend it. Like I said, we can expand to allow for nonlinear constraints, and as well as testing it on other BLS data products. And with that, I will stop there. My email is there. Feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Awesome. Thank you, Lon. As we're going to transition to our next speaker, Michaela Meyer from MITRE. And just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A.
Sorry, I'm struggling to share my screen. Just trying to.
No problem.
Does this work?
All right. Yep, we can see you. We can hear you. Take it away.
Wonderful. So hi everyone. Thank you for attending today's sessions. It's been a great one so far. I am going to be talking about a project that I've been working on with some folks from the Census Bureau about noise injection for automated disclosure avoidance. And as all of the other presentations that have come before, any of the opinions and conclusions I discuss here don't reflect the views of the Census Bureau. I also want to mention that Simon Habib, who's credited as the second author here, started a bulk of this work when he was at MITRE. He's now a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, so I really picked up where he left off for this project. So today I'm going to be talking about an overview of our synthetic validation server, and then talk about the noise injection approaches and experiment methods and results. So first, I'm talking about this in terms of American Community Survey validation, but really you could think about this in terms of any data product from either the Census Bureau, or perhaps there are other government sponsors that are interested in this as well, where someone who's a data user, maybe an academic, but someone who is not at this federal statistics agency wants to work with the microdata. They want to work with individual level responses. And so what we want them to be able to do is use a synthetic data set. They run models and analyses on this synthetic data set, and then they want to understand how their models and analyses would look if they actually ran these models and analyses on the true data sets. So what they do is they submit these models to a validation server where the models can then be run against the internal data. We then produce an internal analysis, and before that validation result can be produced to the public, we use a privacy algorithm to make sure that someone isn't running a model or an analysis that would be disclosive, that would reveal some results that we do not wish them to. And so I'm presenting this in the context of the American Community Survey because the Census Bureau has an interest in making a synthetic data validation server available for the American Community Survey. As we know, the American Community Survey is a very popular data product from the Census Bureau. And so when we want to create this validation server, we really want to try to make sure that it's a pretty automated and model agnostic process. We want this to be something where a human doesn't really have to inject themselves into the loop and say, help with the validation results. So we're considering the scale, the cost, the reproducibility, but also we have this disclosure avoidance piece, where we want to make sure that we are ensuring compliance with disclosure avoidance and security policies with this validation server. So today we're focusing really on this noise injection piece, on this disclosure avoidance concern. And so the idea here is that before we make this validation result available to the public, that we will inject noise into the true microdata such that the released validation results are going to always pass disclosure review, and we don't need a Census Bureau employee to look at these validation results and verify whether they pass disclosure review before releasing. So now I'm going to talk about the various noise injection approaches we tried before then discussing how we assess these noise injection approaches. So the first approach that we tried was the Bayesian bootstrap. In this case, what we do is we have our original microdata set on the left, and each of these microdata sets has tract, block, which are geographic variables on the census data, and then the sex, age, and race and ethnicity of the respondents. And so what we want to do is we want to assign each of these rows a probability from a Dirichlet distribution, and then we are going to sample with replacement rows from this original data set based on those probabilities. And so then you end up with this data set that we have on the right, where we can see that some individuals from the original microdata set might not make it into this Bayesian bootstrap data set. Some of them might appear multiple times now, and also the population sizes now might vary at substate geographies compared with the original microdata. The next approach that we tried was synthetic geographies. So in this case, we start with our original microdata set, and we are only keeping the non-geography variables. So in this case, that is sex, age, and race and ethnicity. We then pass this data set to a classification tree that is trained on the original full data set to predict the geography variables. And so in doing this, we preserve the relationships between the columns, but the number of people in substate geographies is not going to be necessarily maintained. And so you end up then with this data set on the right, which is a data set with synthetic geographies. And again, these relationships are maintained. And then finally, we also tried this approach where we combined the Bayesian bootstraps and synthetic geographies approach. And so in this case, on the left-hand side, we start with our original microdata set. We then apply the Bayesian bootstrap to obtain a new microdata set. And then we keep the non-geography variables from this bootstrap data set. And then from there, we complete the steps for synthesizing substate geographies to be able to obtain the final microdata set. So just to summarize the various approaches that we tried and maybe some pros and cons from them, all three of these noise injection approaches are model agnostic. So if I, as a data user, submit a linear regression model, but someone else, say, submits a logistic regression model as an example, these noise injection approaches are going to work on these different model types. Similarly, all three of these noise injection approaches will make sure that the same statistic across all code gets the same noisy validation value. So if I submit one model that is the same as what someone else is submitting to this validation server, we want to make sure that they get the same noisy validation value. Besides the Bayesian bootstrap, the other two approaches create outcomes that don't exist in the collected data. What we mean by that is that because the Bayesian bootstrap is sampling with replacement from the original data, the characteristics of these individuals will still be reflective of what is true in the microdata set originally, whereas with the synthetic geographies, someone could be placed into a block or tract where someone didn't previously exist with those demographic characteristics. For all of the approaches, they can zero out outcomes that do exist in the collected data. So in the Bayesian bootstrap, you might not make it into the final bootstrap data set. And for the synthetic geographies and the combination approach, again, we might put someone into a block where they might not have originally existed, or similarly, we might have erased effectively a block's population by moving them into different blocks. The synthetic geographies approach does not perturb outcomes that don't exist on substate geographies, but the other two do. And finally, all three approaches ensure protected statistics fall in the possible range for that statistic. So for example, in this case, we're working with counts of people, and so we want to make sure that we never end up with a negative count. And using these noise injection approaches compared to, say, differential privacy or a different privacy enhancing technology ensures that our protected statistics will still fall in the possible range without any extra work. So next I'm going to talk about how we evaluated each of these noise injection approaches. And we did this by looking at reconstruction re-identification attacks and how these noise injection approaches would stand up to these kinds of attacks. So on the left-hand side, we have our published tabular statistics, an example of them at least. And basically in a reconstruction module, what you're trying to do is you're trying to use the tabulated statistics to recreate a microdata set that matches these tabulations. So now we have on the right-hand side our reconstructed microdata. And so, for example, we see here that there are 7 people in block 1234. And now in our reconstructed microdata set, we still have 7 rows in this data set. And if we were to look at the median age for our reconstructed microdata, this should match the median age in this column for the published tabular statistics. So it might not necessarily be the exact microdata set. We hope that it's not. But there are probably going to be some matches between the reconstructed microdata and the true microdata set. The next thing that we do is we look at re-identification. So we're trying to answer this exact question of how can we make a match between our reconstructed data and the true data. So now we're trying to compare this reconstructed microdata set that we have across, say, block, age, and sex, and comparing that to our original microdata set and trying to see how many matches we can make. It's inevitable that you can probably find some matches in doing this kind of reconstruction re-identification attack, but we're hoping to minimize these match rates. So the methods for assessing our noise injection approaches hold across all of these various noise injection approaches. What we did was we took 2017 data from the ACS from Illinois, specifically because Illinois has a range of tracts and blocks. They have some urban blocks and tracts, but also plenty of rural blocks and tracts. And we wanted to know how our noise injection approaches would work in each of these kinds of geographic areas. We then apply our noise injection strategy to this ACS data, and we do this 5 times. So for each of our noise injection approaches, we have 5 implicates of the bootstrapped and/or synthesized ACS files. From there, we create our average microdata set based on these 5 implicates. And from this average microdata set, we then go on to make our demonstration product tables or our tabulated statistics. And then once we have these synthetic tabulations, we can pass them on to our reconstruction re-identification modules. We base our experiments on the 2010 decennial census's reconstruction re-identification experiment. And we also compare our results from these experiments to a baseline approach, where we took the original ACS microdata, constructed demonstration product tables, and then passed these on to the reconstruction re-identification modules. So there was no noise injection happening in these baseline approaches. So I'm now going to talk about our results, which is looking really at these overall match rates and the precision of these matches. So for each of our noise injection approaches, we have the putative match rate, which is where we're making matches based on race, sex, on sex, age, and block and tract. And then the confirmation match rate is looking at those same variables, except now we're also considering race and ethnicity. And the precision is the putative match rate divided by the confirmation match rate, the confirmation match rate divided by the putative match rate. And so we're trying to basically say in the precision metric that how confident should I be when I'm guessing that I'm making a putative match? Because a confirmation match basically means that we have found this exact individual in the original microdata. And so what we see here is that all of our noise injection approaches decrease the putative and confirmation match rates overall. Their precision rates vary, and so we would probably prefer the synthetic geographies or the combination approach in terms of the precision. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster here just to wrap up, but we also wanted to make sure that we looked at these match rates based on the size of the block. So on the y-axis here, we have our putative match rate, and on the x-axis now, we've binned our blocks based on the block's population. So on the left-hand side, we have the smallest blocks, which have 0 to 9 people in them, and on the right-hand side, we have our largest blocks, which have 100 to 249 people in them. We see that for our baseline approach, the match rates for putative match rates are very high regardless of the block size. We see that for our noise injection approaches that they're really minimizing the putative match rates for the smaller blocks, though we do see an increasing trend, whereas the population size is increasing, so are our putative match rates. Basically, this seems to be because when we are looking at these larger blocks, that means that we have a higher likelihood of having a synthetic data set that looks more like reality for these larger blocks. So for example, thinking about the synthetic geographies approach, if I'm looking at a model that is trying to predict someone's geography, that model is probably going to predict that they're in a more populous geography, which means that now you're going to have a higher likelihood of making those putative matches for these larger blocks. We see similar trends when we look at the confirmation match rates, where again, we are able to decrease for the most part these confirmation match rates across block sizes with our noise injection approaches, but we also still see this increasing trend. So in conclusion, all of our noise injection approaches decrease precision rates compared to the baseline approach, and our confirmed and putative match rates are the lowest for our noise injection approaches across less populous blocks. Thank you for coming to this talk. Happy to answer any questions here, but also feel free to reach out to me via this email address for further questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Michaela. So we're going to transition to our last speaker of the session, John Grant. And again, a reminder to post your questions to the Q&A. I see Alon's been busy answering in the question answers. So post them there. Hopefully we'll finish with a couple minutes to spare. So if any of the presenters have live questions they want to post to each other, we'll be able to do that. So I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thanks. Are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing your screen. It's not maybe not full screen, but we can see it.
Yeah. All right, let me. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is John Grant, and I'm a statistical researcher with the United States Department of Agriculture at the National Agricultural Statistics Service, or USDA NASS for short. Our mission at NASS, which is summarized in small letters at the bottom of the slide, is providing timely, accurate, and useful statistics in service to U.S. agriculture. And I'm going to talk today about entropy as a measure of disclosure risk for tabular data. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Luca Sartori and Alex Tarter. Okay, so just a brief disclaimer. Findings and conclusions in this presentation are those of the authors, should not be construed to represent any official USDA or government policy. And then there's a statement there about funding. All right, so first a bit about statistical disclosure limitation, just for those who may not be as familiar. We've heard some about it earlier. But statistical disclosure limitation, or SDL for short, refers to the wide range of methods used to protect the confidentiality of statistical data. Examples include differential privacy, cell suppression, controlled tabular adjustment, random tabular adjustment, and numerous others. So a key challenge in SDL is how to deal with the trade-off between disclosure risk and data utility. So in general, the more that data is altered, either through removing sensitive values or adding noise, the less useful the data becomes. So the goal is always to strike the right balance between privacy protection and utility. Okay, so the U.S. Department of Agriculture, NASS, currently uses cell suppression, which we heard some about earlier, to protect the privacy of survey respondents. I'll say a bit more about how NASS uses cell suppression in a moment. But NASS is interested in exploring other SDL techniques for future publications, including differential privacy and random tabular adjustment, or RTA for short. So in order to make informed choices about appropriate SDL techniques, we need to identify metrics for privacy risk and utility so we can compare the performance of different SDL methods. So in general, it's challenging to find versatile metrics that can be used to compare the disclosure risk associated with different SDL techniques. For example, a risk metric designed for cell suppression may not necessarily be useful for evaluating differential privacy. Okay, information entropy and disclosure risk. So in general, SDL methods reduce information content, leading to an increased entropy. And I'll talk a little bit more about entropy in a moment. But less information in a data set means greater uncertainty, and by definition, then greater entropy. Entropy-based metrics quantify this information loss and can be applied across a wide range of SDL techniques. Since all SDL techniques involve increasing the uncertainty of the data set, either by removing values or adding noise, then in general, entropy is a useful tool for assessing SDL methods. So Antal, Shlomo, and Elliott in 2014 proposed an entropy-based disclosure risk measure for population-based frequency tables. And those are tables that just contain discrete counts, discrete frequency counts. And that's the paper that our work here builds on. So, however, tabular data sets often contain a mix of cells with frequency counts and cells with continuous numerical data. And this is common with NAS data as well. So we propose an extension of the existing measure to accommodate these more generalized cases, that is, cases with both discrete and continuous cell values. And this approach, like the original approach, can be applied to entire tables or subsets of tables, both before and after disclosure protection. So you could apply this to part of a table, you could even apply it to a single column or row within a table. So here I want to give the definition of information entropy, just briefly for those who may not be as familiar with the idea. The information entropy or Shannon entropy of a random variable x is usually represented by h of x, and it's equal to this negative sum here where we're summing over the support set for the random variable. So this script x is the set of possible values that x can take on, and p of x is the probability that it actually takes on any one of those specific values. This logarithm here is usually base 2, and if so, that gives us the standard units for information entropy, which are bits. And this formula provides a measure of the uncertainty associated with the random variable's possible outcomes, the formula being exact for discrete distributions. Risk measure for frequency tables. So the original disclosure risk measure that was proposed by Antal, Shlomo, and Elliott is based on entropy, and it's designed to satisfy several key properties. And these properties were specifically chosen to support effective risk assessment of tabular data, and also to enable comparisons across different frequency tables. So their measure consisted of 3 weighted terms, and each one reflects a different aspect of disclosure risk. So the first term quantifies the entropy of the frequency distribution, and the second term quantifies the risk from small cell count. So in general, small cells have a higher disclosure risk than larger cells. And the third term quantifies the risk from table sparsity, and that's just to account for the fact that tables with a higher proportion of zeros in general propose a greater disclosure risk. And finally, the risk measure is bounded between 0 and 1 by construction, with 1 being the highest possible risk. And since the measure is normalized in this way, that makes it a useful tool for comparing the disclosure risk between different data sets. So we actually propose extending the existing framework to accommodate continuous valued cells. And this was achieved by introducing a 4th weighted term that quantifies the entropy of the continuous valued cells. The new term was constructed so that the properties of the original measure are preserved. And so this then allows the measure to be applied more broadly, including hybrid tables that have both discrete and continuous values. And some of the data published by NAS falls into that category. Okay, so here I've included the formula for the risk measure, and I don't want to get too in the weeds talking about the formula. It's just here for reference. There's a lot of different letters and things there that would need to be defined. But the important thing is I've just highlighted in red here that we've added this additional term with an additional weight. This sum here is summing up the entropy of the continuous valued cells in the table. And M is the normalization factor. And then W1, 2, 3, and 4 are the weights, which need to sum up to 1. If you'd like to know more about that formula, I would refer you to the original paper for the definitions of all these various terms. So next I'll say a bit about the current SDL methods used by NAS. So NAS currently applies cell suppression before publishing tabular data. And we heard some about this earlier, so I'm just going to give a broad overview here. But in cell suppression, privacy is protected by first identifying and suppressing primary sensitive cells. And then as we heard earlier, additional complementary cells are then suppressed to protect the primary cells against an attacker. And the attacker, this is done in such a way that attackers can only estimate suppressed cell values within a predetermined acceptable range which is known as the attack interval. Okay, so the next step was to apply our proposed measure to a sample NAS data set to see how it performs. So the table that we selected for our analysis contains county level data from an average state from the U.S. Census of Agriculture. That table contains both cells with discrete counts, which in that case were farms, and cells with continuous values, which were acreages in that table. And the entropy-based measure was applied before and after the table was protected by cell suppression. And we evaluated the performance of the proposed measure across varying weight configurations for its 4 component terms. Now, in general, there's some flexibility in how the weights are selected, and in practice, the choice of the weights would probably depend on the data set. So we wanted to look at a variety of different weighting schemes. But the first one that we chose here was just the simplest, which is let's set all 4 weights equal. So they're all equal to 0.25 so that it sums to 1. And here I'm talking about risk score. Just to clarify, the risk score is just the value that's yielded by this entropy-based privacy risk measure. And so the original risk score before cell suppression, we found to be 0.4817. The final risk score after cell suppression was 0.4297. So the risk measure indicates lower disclosure risk after cell suppression, which is what we would expect if it's performing properly. So next, to investigate the performance of the measure across different weighting schemes, we computed the empirical distributions of the entropy score based on randomized weights. And the weights were taken from a Dirichlet distribution. Dirichlet distribution here just means that the weights are uniformly chosen across all combinations of the 4 weights such that they're non-negative and they all add up to 1. So under this randomization, we found that the mean risk score before cell suppression was 0.4850, and the mean risk score after cell suppression was 0.4260. So again, this is what we would hope for if it's actually working properly. Okay, so here are the distributions of the risk scores using the randomized weights. The upper plot there shows the risk scores, or the measure value, if you like, for the unprotected table. And then the lower plot there shows the distribution of risk scores after cell suppression. So we saw that the mean score was smaller after cell suppression. And here is this kind of a subtle effect, but we can see that the entire distribution of scores, this green distribution, is shifted slightly to the left after cell suppression, which indicates an overall lower disclosure risk. Okay, so conclusions and future research. The proposed risk measure yields a lower value after cell suppression, which suggests a lower privacy risk. So it seems to perform well here under cell suppression. So for future work, we'd like to apply the same measure before and after other SDL methods, such as differential privacy and random tabular adjustment. Those are 2 methods that NASA is interested in exploring for the future. Key challenge is how to compute the entropy for continuous valued cells when they're protected by various SDL techniques. So it could be different noise techniques. And then going forward, this measure can compare disclosure risk across different SDL methods and could be used to guide optimal SDL strategy selection for a future census of agriculture. And here are some selected references. This top one here is the paper that I was talking about. And thanks a lot for your attention. If anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Thanks, John. I just want to thank all our speakers. Did a fabulous job staying on time. Didn't have to give anybody the hook. And we've got a couple minutes. If any of the speakers have questions for each other, this would be a great time to either to just hop on and ask each other. Also, feel free to utilize the question and answer Q&A feature. So I will take a minute and open up to you general questions.
Matt, there is one question in the Q&A.
Thanks, Lisa. I think this is probably for John. Do you see it? How do you pick the weights?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the weights, so in the original paper, they had a suggestion on the weighting scheme. And as I mentioned, there were three terms. They suggested a much higher weight for the entropy term because they believe that that's the core of the risk measure. So in general, I think the entropy term should be weighted more, but it is also going to depend on your specific data set. So it depends on how sparse your data is, and also there's some leeway there for the agency to decide which types of disclosure risk they're the most concerned with, and therefore they could adjust those weights to reflect that.
Thanks. I will say, John, that was exciting to see you all tackle the continuous variables. I think it's a struggle when you're looking at, all these methods in the design for tabular counts. And you're like, but what if I have, what if I have total acres or, total yield or, value of sales or something? What do I do for that? So I think it's awesome that you all are tackling that. That was more of a
Yeah,
comment than a question.
that's going to be some interesting work going forward. Different ways to approximate the distribution of the continuous values, or maybe decide what parameters you would use to characterize those distributions. So those will be interesting questions as we go forward.
All right. Well, again, feel free to put questions in the Q&A. Let's see. Oh, another one for you, John. Um, is the after risk measure low enough to consider safe? So,
Well, I think that it's also going to depend on whether or not, so that was using cell suppression, right? And we've used some kind of P% rule to decide how the cell suppression would work. So I think that in that case, we would say that the table is protected to our satisfaction based off of the cell suppression algorithm.
thanks. Okay, last chance for a live question. All right, I think we're ready to transition to the next session. Thank you all for great presentations and discussion.